On a suffocating Saturday morning in August 1960 during a routine military exercise in Brooklyn, a child vanished without a trace. What nobody knew was that Bucky Andrew wouldn't become just another cold case. He would become part of one of the darkest secrets of the American Cold War. The sun had not yet reached its peak when hundreds of military families began gathering at the fields of Fort Hamilton, Brooklyn. It was August 13, 1960, a Saturday that promised to be like any other civil preparedness training. Evacuation drills, emergency simulations, families learning protocols they hoped never to use in reality. Margaret Andrew adjusted her Red Cross military volunteer uniform while watching her son Bucky, only 7 years old, running among groups of children. The boy wore a light blue shirt and khaki pants, the outfit his mother had carefully chosen the night before. Blonde haircut, short bright blue eyes, a smile that revealed a slightly crooked front tooth. Margaret would memorize every detail of that morning for the next 40 years. Sergeant Robert Andrew, Bucky's father, was in his final days before deployment to Vietnam. The tension of his imminent departure hung over the family like a loaded cloud. But Robert had insisted on participating in the training. "I want you to know how to protect yourselves while I'm away," he'd said the night before, holding Margaret's hand with unusual force. The exercise began at 9:15 a.m. Sirens simulated air raid warnings. Families ran in organized formations to designated shelters. Military personnel in reflective vests guided the flow of people. The controlled chaos was exactly what was expected, a rehearsal for a war everyone feared, but few fully understood. Bucky was with a group of children under volunteer supervision, approximately 50 meters from where Margaret coordinated a simulated first aid station. Robert was at the opposite end of the field, helping organize evacuation routes. For 23 minutes, everything went according to plan. It happened during the transition between the second and third exercises. Margaret looked at the group of children, counted mentally as she'd done compulsively since Bucky was born. 18 children. Her heart accelerated. There should be 19. She counted again, slower. 18. Bucky wasn't there. "Where's the boy in the blue shirt?" Margaret asked the supervisor, trying to control the tremor in her voice. "He was here a minute ago. Maybe he went to the bathroom." But Margaret was already running. She screamed her son's name while crossing the field, people looking startled at the panicked Red Cross volunteer. Robert heard the screams and started running too, his military training temporarily forgotten in the face of paternal terror. In the following 15 minutes, the evacuation exercise transformed into a real search operation. More than 200 people scoured every inch of Fort Hamilton. Bathrooms, storage facilities, military vehicles, underground shelters, nothing. Bucky Andrew had disappeared as if he'd never existed. What would transform this case from family nightmare into something much larger began to emerge when investigators interviewed witnesses. 3 different people, a soldier, a volunteer mother, and a janitor, reported seeing something strange shortly before the disappearance. "There was a man in uniform watching the children," said Soldier James Kellerman in his statement. "It wasn't a standard uniform, looked camouflaged but not like ours. I thought he was from some visiting special unit." The volunteer mother, Helen Morrison, was more specific. "He wore dark glasses even inside the hangar. He stood for about 5 minutes just watching. When I tried to approach to ask if he needed help, he left quickly." The janitor, a World War II veteran named Eddie Bronson, added the most disturbing detail. "I saw him talking to one of the children. He seemed to be showing something, a badge perhaps. The child looked interested and followed in his direction. I thought he was one of their fathers, but nobody could describe the man's face with sufficient precision." And when investigators checked the base's entry records that morning, they discovered something impossible. There was no record of anyone matching that description. It was as if the man had materialized from nowhere and disappeared the same way, taking Bucky Andrew with him. At 6 p.m. that Saturday, as the sun began to set over Brooklyn, Margaret Andrew sat on the floor of the base commander's office, clutching Bucky's blue shirt they'd found abandoned near the perimeter fence. Robert was on the phone with the FBI, and somewhere unknown, a A 7-year-old boy who should have been having dinner with his family was being transported to a destination nobody could yet imagine. Bucky Andrews' disappearance would become national headlines by Monday. But the truth behind that August Saturday would remain buried for nearly 40 years, protected by layers of military secrets, classified operations, and a network of silence, extending from Brooklyn suburbs to Southeast Asian jungles. What really happened to Bucky Andrew that morning? Why would a boy disappear in a military base, surrounded by hundreds of witnesses? And who was the uniformed man nobody could identify? In the next block, follow how the initial investigation would reveal disturbing contradictions, and how Bucky's own father would become a suspect in a twist that almost destroyed the Andrew family before the real search could even begin. When a military child vanishes from a secure base, the investigation should be straightforward. But what happens when the evidence points in impossible directions and the main suspect becomes the grieving father himself? By Monday morning, August 15th, the disappearance of Bucky Andrew had exploded across national newspapers. "Military child vanishes from Brooklyn base," screamed the New York Times. Headline: The case had everything the media craved. A photogenic missing child, a military family on the brink of wartime deployment, and the unsettling fact that a 7-year-old had disappeared from what should have been one of the most secure locations in New York. Special Agent Thomas Brennan of the FBI arrived at Fort Hamilton at dawn. A veteran investigator with 15 years of experience in kidnapping cases, Brennan had seen the worst humanity could offer. But something about this case felt different from the moment he stepped onto the base grounds. The problem, Brennan would later write in his case notes, wasn't lack of evidence. It was too much evidence pointing in contradictory directions. The initial investigation revealed a disturbing pattern. The mysterious man in the partial camouflage uniform had been seen by multiple witnesses, yet security cameras had captured nothing. The base had 6 active cameras covering entry points and main thoroughfares. None showed anyone matching the description entering or leaving during the relevant time frame. Even more puzzling, Bucky's blue shirt was found near the southern perimeter fence, but military dogs tracking his scent led investigators to the northern vehicle depot, before losing the trail completely at a spot where several military trucks had been parked that morning. "It's like the boy was in 2 places at once," said Detective Raymond Walsh of the NYPD, assigned to work jointly with federal investigators. Or, someone wanted us to think he was. The investigation took its first dark turn on Wednesday, August 17th, when Agent Brennan requested a formal interview with Sergeant Robert Andrew. The transcript of that interview would haunt the family for years. Brennan: "Sergeant Andrew, can you account for your movements between 9:30 and 9:45 a.m. on Saturday?" Robert: "I was organizing evacuation routes on the eastern field. I've already stated this." Brennan: "We have 3 witnesses who place you near the vehicle depot during that time frame." Robert: "That's impossible. I was nowhere near the depot." Brennan: "Can anyone confirm your location?" Robert: "There were dozens of people around me." Brennan: "Yet nobody specifically remembers seeing you during those 15 minutes. The implication was clear and devastating. Investigators had developed a preliminary theory. Robert Andrew, facing deployment to a war zone he might not survive, had potentially staged his son's disappearance to avoid going to Vietnam. The motive seemed plausible to some investigators, a desperate act by a father who couldn't bear to leave his family. Margaret Andrew learned of her husband's suspect status when 2 military police officers arrived at her home Thursday morning to escort Robert to additional questioning. She stood in the doorway watching her husband, the man who'd searched frantically for their son, being treated like a criminal. "They think I did something to my own boy," Robert said quietly that night, after being released pending further investigation. His voice was hollow. "They think I made him disappear." The suspicion against Robert Andrew did more than traumatize the family. It diverted critical resources and attention from the real investigation. While agents focused on deconstructing Robert's timeline and examining his psychological profile, potential leads grew cold. Meanwhile, the case attracted another layer of complexity due to its timing and context. It was 1960, the height of Cold War paranoia. Kennedy would be elected president in 3 months. The Berlin crisis was escalating. American military bases were on heightened alert for potential Soviet infiltration. Commander Gerald Hastings, Fort Hamilton's ranking officer, convened a classified briefing on August 20th. The contents of that meeting wouldn't be fully disclosed for decades, but attendees later confirmed. The discussion centered on a troubling question. Could Bucky Andrews' disappearance be connected to espionage or foreign intelligence operations? We considered every angle, retired Colonel Martin Vickers would admit in a 1999 interview. Hostage situation, leverage against military families, even the possibility the child had been taken to extract information about troop movements. That father was days away from Vietnam deployment. Who knew what classified information he might have access to? The investigation expanded to include counterintelligence officers. Margaret and Robert's phone. Lines were tapped. Their mail was intercepted and read. Friends and neighbors were interviewed about their political affiliations. The search for a missing child had become entangled with national security concerns. But the most significant obstacle emerged from bureaucratic infighting between agencies. The FBI wanted to treat it as a federal kidnapping case. Military investigators insisted it was a matter of base security and should be handled internally. The NYPD claimed jurisdictional authority. Each agency guarded information zealously, refusing to share critical details with the others. We were chasing the same leads 3 different ways, Detective Walsh recalled. Nobody trusted anybody. The left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing. By September 1st, 3 weeks after Bucky's disappearance, the investigation had generated over 500 pages of reports, interviewed 127 witnesses, and pursued 34 separate leads. Yet they were no closer to finding the boy than they'd been on that first terrible Saturday. Robert Andrew received his deployment orders on September 10th. He stood in his living room, holding the paperwork, facing an impossible choice: refuse deployment and face court-martial while under suspicion for his son's disappearance, or leave his devastated wife alone to continue searching for their child. Margaret made the decision for him. "You have to go," she said, her voice steady, despite tears streaming down her face. "We can't give them any more reasons to suspect you. I'll find him. I promise you, Robert, I will find our son." On September 15, 1960, Sergeant Robert Andrew boarded a transport plane bound for Southeast Asia. He carried with him a photo of Bucky, the weight of suspicion, and the unbearable knowledge that he was leaving behind. Everything that mattered. The official investigation continued for another 6 months before being quietly downgraded to inactive status. The file was transferred to a cold case unit. Bureaucratic attention moved on to other crises, other disappearances, other families shattered by inexplicable loss. But for Margaret Andrew, the investigation was far from over. It was only beginning. How does a mother continue searching when the entire system has given up? What happens when official channels close but a parent's determination refuses to die? In the next block, witness Margaret Andrews' solitary crusade through 15 years of darkness, and discover how her obsessive search would test the limits of hope, nearly destroy her marriage, and transform her into something between investigator and ghost hunter in her own life. Robert Andrew survived Vietnam. That was the clinical way to describe it. He returned to Brooklyn in March 1963 after 2 tours of duty, with a Bronze Star, a Purple Heart, and a psychological fracture that would never fully heal. He'd gone to war carrying the image of his missing son. He came back carrying the ghosts of everything he'd lost, both in Southeast Asian jungles and on a Brooklyn military base. The man who stepped off the transport plane at Fort Hamilton was not the same man who'd left. Margaret saw it immediately in his eyes. A distance, a disconnection, as if some essential part of Robert had been left behind in the red clay of a country most Americans couldn't locate on a map. "Did you find him?" Robert asked. It was the first question, before hello, before any greeting. Margaret's silence was answer enough. What followed were 15 years that could best be described as suspended animation. A family frozen in the moment of loss, unable to move forward, unwilling to let go. But calling it family was generous. By 1965, Robert and Margaret were married in name only, two people occupying the same house, sleeping in separate rooms, united only by the ghost of their missing son. Margaret's transformation began within weeks of Robert's deployment in 1960. With official channels stalled and investigative momentum lost, she became her own detective, advocate, and keeper of Bucky's memory. Her dining room table disappeared beneath stacks of missing children reports, newspaper clippings, and hand-drawn maps marking potential leads. She developed a system. Every morning at 6 a.m., she would sit at that table with her coffee and work through her lists, daily tasks, check post office box for responses to latest round of letters, call 5 new police departments or sheriff's offices, update master spreadsheet of sightings and leads, add new missing children cases to comparison database, maintain correspondence with other searching families. By 1962, Margaret had contacted every police department on the eastern seaboard. By 1965, she'd expanded nationwide. By 1970, she'd begun reaching out to military bases. Overseas, convinced that Bucky's disappearance from a military facility meant the answer lay somewhere in the sprawling apparatus of the American defense establishment. Her letters followed a template she'd refined over hundreds of iterations. My name is Margaret Andrew. On August 13, 1960, my 7-year-old son Bucky disappeared from Fort Hamilton, Brooklyn. He was last seen wearing a light blue shirt and khaki pants. He has blonde hair, blue eyes, and a slightly crooked front tooth. If you have any information about cases involving unidentified children, international adoptions with unclear documentation, or any unusual circumstances involving military personnel and children during the early 1960s, please contact me immediately. She sent these letters to adoption agencies, children's hospitals, military chaplains, Red Cross offices, embassy personnel, and anyone else who might have encountered a displaced child. Most went unanswered. Some received brief, polite responses expressing sympathy, but offering no information. A handful generated false hope, leads that led nowhere, sightings that dissolved upon investigation. But Margaret Andrew was nothing if not persistent. She was obsessed, their neighbor Dorothy Chen recalled in a 1998 interview. And I don't mean that critically. It was what she had to do to survive. Some people would have broken. Margaret turned her grief into a mission. The mission consumed everything. Margaret lost her volunteer position with the Red Cross. Her supervisors suggested gently that perhaps she needed to focus on her own healing. She took a part-time job at a library specifically because it gave her access to newspapers from across the country. She spent her lunch breaks in the reference section, scanning microfiche for any story involving missing or unidentified children. Robert watched his wife disappear into this quest, helpless to pull her back. His own trauma from Vietnam made him retreat inward, while Margaret's trauma pushed her outward in an endless, frantic search. They existed in separate orbits, occasionally intersecting at dinner or in passing, but never truly connecting. Their conversations became transactional. "I'm going to Philadelphia this weekend," Margaret would say. "Someone responded to my letter about an unidentified boy found in 1961. "Okay," Robert would respond. "I'll need money for gas and the motel." "Okay." These weekend trips became routine. Margaret would drive hundreds of miles pursuing leads that were almost always dead ends. A child with the wrong age, wrong physical characteristics, or a clear documented history that ruled out any connection to Bucky. She'd return Sunday night, defeated but not deterred, already planning the next trip. The financial strain was considerable. Margaret's obsessive search consumed funds they didn't have. Robert's military pension covered basic expenses, but the constant travel, long-distance phone calls, and copies of documents added up. By 1968, they'd taken a second mortgage on their house. "Is this what he would want?" Robert asked one night in 1969, during one of their rare direct confrontations. "For us to destroy ourselves?" "Don't you dare," Margaret shot back, her voice sharp. "Don't you dare suggest I should stop looking for our son." I'm not suggesting that. I'm asking if there's a way to search without losing yourself entirely. When you figure out how to do that, Robert, you let me know." The conversation ended there, as most of their conversations did, in silence and separate rooms. The Andrew house took on a shrine-like quality. Bucky's bedroom remained exactly as it had been on August 13th, 1960. His bed was made with his favorite spaceship bedspread. His books sat on the shelf in the order he'd last arranged them. His toy soldiers remained positioned in whatever battle formation he'd been conducting before the world ended. Margaret dusted that room every Sunday. She refused to let Robert enter. "He needs to recognize it when he comes home," she'd say, present tense, as if Bucky might walk through the door at any moment. But the most haunting ritual was the one that occurred every August 13th, on the anniversary of Bucky's disappearance. Margaret would set an extra place at the dinner table, Bucky's favorite plate, his special cup, a chair pulled out waiting. She would light a candle and place it in front of the empty seat. Robert participated the first few years, sitting across from that empty chair, neither of them eating, both of them crying. By 1968, he could no longer bear it. He'd work late those days, or visit a bar, returning home only after Margaret had cleared the table and extinguished the candle. The social isolation was complete by the early 1970s. Friends had long since stopped inviting them to gatherings. Who wants to attend a dinner party where the hostess might suddenly excuse herself to take notes on a missing children broadcast? Who wants to make small talk with a couple radiating such profound, contagious grief? Even their extended families pulled away. Robert's brother suggested in 1971 that perhaps they should accept reality and move forward. Margaret didn't speak to him for 3 years. Her own sister, after a particularly painful visit where Margaret had broken down upon seeing her sister's children, stopped coming around entirely. They became like ghosts themselves, Dorothy Chen recalled. You'd see Margaret leaving for the library in the morning, Robert returning from whatever job he was working, but they were barely there. They were living in 1960, in that moment when everything stopped. The late 1960s and early 1970s brought new cases of missing children that captured national attention. Each one renewed Margaret's hope that perhaps increased awareness would finally break her own case open. She attended conferences for families of missing children, networked with other searching parents, shared techniques for keeping cases alive in public consciousness. But Bucky's case remained stubbornly cold. Time, which Margaret had thought might be her ally, surely someone would eventually come forward, surely the truth couldn't stay hidden forever, became her enemy. Witnesses died or moved away. Records were lost in bureaucratic reshuffling. The investigation file gathered dust in a basement storage facility. By 1975, 15 years after Bucky's disappearance, Margaret Andrew was 47 years old. She looked 60. The relentless stress had carved lines deep into her face, turned her hair prematurely gray, and given her the appearance of someone who'd been weathered by forces beyond human endurance. She sat at her dining room table on the morning of August 13th, 1975, surrounded by 15 years of accumulated research. Hundreds of pounds of paper, letters, reports, articles, notes representing thousands of hours of obsessive searching. She lit the annual candle, set the extra place at the table, and allowed herself for the first time to ask the question she'd forbidden for 15 years. What if she never found him? What if Bucky Andrew remained forever lost? Forever 7 years old, forever frozen? In that moment of disappearance, the candle flickered, the empty chair sat waiting, and Margaret Andrew, who had refused to give up for 15 years, felt something inside her begin to crack. After 38 years of silence, sometimes the answer arrives not through human persistence, but through the cold logic of machines, ones and zeros connecting dots that exhausted investigators had missed for decades. The Defense Department's Combined DNA Index System, CODIS for military personnel, wasn't designed to solve cold missing children cases. It was developed in the late 1990s to identify remains of soldiers killed in action, to provide closure to families who'd been waiting decades for answers about Vietnam War casualties, and to establish a comprehensive genetic database for future military identification needs. James Holbrook, a 52-year-old Army veteran working as a civilian contractor for the Department of Defense, wasn't looking for missing children either. His job involved running genetic samples through the system, comparing unidentified remains with family DNA profiles, sending notifications to families who'd been waiting 30 years to bury their dead. It was tedious, emotionally draining work. Each match meant closure for one family, but also the confirmation of loss they'd been holding at bay with hope. On March 15, 1998, Holbrook was processing a routine batch of samples when something unusual appeared on his screen. The system had flagged a partial match, not strong enough for definitive identification, but significant enough to trigger an alert. What made it unusual was the nature of the match itself. The sample came from Michael Reyes, a 45-year-old man who'd voluntarily submitted DNA as part of a veteran outreach program. The partial match connected him to a cold case reference sample in the system, one submitted decades earlier by Margaret Andrew in her desperate attempts to keep her son's case alive. Holbrook stared at the screen, running the analysis again. Partial matches weren't uncommon. Distant relatives, statistical coincidences. But something about this particular match nagged at him. The genetic markers were too close to dismiss, yet the circumstances seemed impossible. Michael Reyes, according to his file, was born in the Philippines in 1953 and adopted by an American military family in 1961. If the genetic match was accurate, he couldn't possibly be Bucky Andrew, who was born in 1953 in Brooklyn and disappeared in 1960. Unless Holbrook pulled the full case file for Bucky Andrew. He'd been doing this work long enough to have developed instincts about which cases deserved deeper investigation. This one triggered every alarm bell he'd learned to trust. He began with the adoption records. Michael Reyes had been adopted by Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Reyes and his wife Sarah in Manila, Philippines, in June 1961. The paperwork indicated the child was approximately 8 years old, found abandoned, near Clark Air Base, no parents or family identifiable. The adoption was processed through military channels, expedited, given the Cold War context and the Reyes family's impending transfer back to the United States. Holbrook requested additional documentation. What he received was frustratingly sparse. The original intake documents from the Philippine orphanage were lost in a fire in 1967. Medical records from the child's first examination were missing. The only photograph in the file showed a boy with short dark hair and tanned skin, nothing immediately suggestive of the blonde, blue-eyed Bucky Andrew. But Holbrook had learned that documents could lie. Genetics didn't. He spent the next 6 months pursuing leads through unofficial channels, calling in favors from colleagues, accessing databases he technically shouldn't have been accessing. What emerged was a pattern that defied innocent explanation. In the early 1960s, there had been at least 17 cases of American children adopted through military channels in Southeast Asia, under circumstances that, upon closer examination, appeared highly irregular. Children with no verifiable background documentation, expedited, adoptions that bypassed normal legal processes, ages that didn't quite match physical appearance, adoptive parents who were intelligence officers or had classified assignments, orphanages that had suspiciously convenient fires or administrative gaps. Holbrook created a database, cross-referencing missing children cases in the United States with international adoptions involving military families during the same time frame. The correlations were disturbing. In September 1998, he reached out to Margaret Andrew. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Margaret, now 70 years old and living alone, Robert had died of a heart attack in 1994, had stopped actively searching years earlier. The dining room table had finally been cleared. Bucky's room had been converted to a sewing space, though she still couldn't bring herself to give away his belongings. Mrs. Andrew, my name is James Holbrook. I work for the Department of Defense. I'm calling about your son, Bucky. Margaret's hand tightened on the phone. She'd received calls like this before. False leads, well-meaning but mistaken strangers, occasionally cruel hoaxers. She'd learned to manage her expectations. "Go ahead," she said, her voice neutral. "I have reason to believe your son may be alive. Living under the name Michael Reyes." The world tilted. Margaret sat down heavily. "Explain." Holbrook did, methodically laying out the genetic evidence, the adoption irregularities, the pattern he'd discovered. He was careful not to promise anything definitive. The match was only partial, the circumstantial evidence strong but not conclusive. "I need to approach Mr. Reyes directly," Holbrook explained. "But I wanted to contact you first. If this is your son, Mrs. Andrew, this is going to be complicated." "Complicated," Margaret repeated. "My son disappeared 38 years ago. Complicated doesn't begin to cover it." Michael Reyes lived in Sacramento, California. He was a software engineer, married with 2 teenage children, active in his church community. By all accounts, he'd lived a normal, successful life since his adoption in 1961. Holbrook flew to Sacramento in November 1998. He'd called ahead, explained vaguely that there were questions about Michael's adoption records. Michael agreed to meet, curious but not particularly concerned. He'd known he was adopted. His parents had always been open about it. They met in a coffee shop near Michael's office. Holbrook could see the man's confusion as he explained the situation. The genetic match, the disappearance in Brooklyn, the possibility that Michael's entire understanding of his origins might be wrong. "You're saying I might be a kidnapped child?" Michael asked, his voice carefully controlled. "That I was taken from my family?" "I'm saying there are significant questions that need answering," Holbrook replied. "Are you willing to take a comprehensive DNA test?" Michael Reyes went home that night and told his wife there was a possibility he wasn't who he thought he was. She held him while he processed the implications, that the parents who'd raised him, now both deceased, might have participated in something monstrous, that somewhere he might have a biological family who'd been searching for him for nearly 4 decades. The comprehensive DNA test was conducted in December 1998. Results took 6 weeks to process. During that time, Holbrook continued his investigation into the network of irregular adoptions. What he discovered suggested not random criminal acts, but something systematic, a program, though whether official or rogue, he couldn't yet determine. Partially declassified documents from the early 1960s revealed coded references to Operation Protective Custody, a classified program involving the relocation of sensitive minors during Cold War operations. The details were heavily redacted, but the implication was clear. Children were being moved, identities were being altered, all under the umbrella of national security. On February 3, 1999, the DNA results came back. Michael Reyes was Bucky Andrew. Probability, 99.97%. Holbrook called Margaret first. "Mrs. Andrew, I found your son. He's alive." There was silence on the line. Then a sound that Holbrook would remember for the rest of his life. A sob that contained 38 years of grief, hope, loss, and sudden, overwhelming relief. "Where is he?" Margaret whispered. "Sacramento." And Mrs. Andrew? He didn't know. He had no idea. The logistics of reunion were complex. Michael needed time to process the revelation that his entire life had been based on a lie. Margaret, after waiting 38 years, now had to wait a few weeks more to respect her son's need for psychological preparation. But Holbrook wasn't done investigating. Finding Bucky Andrew alive raised more questions than it answered. How had a 7-year-old been taken from a secure military base, transported to the Philippines, and placed with a military family, all without leaving a clear paper trail? The answer, Holbrook discovered, lay in the intersection of Cold War paranoia, intelligence operations, and a network of individuals who believed they were serving a greater good. Children of military personnel, particularly those in sensitive positions, were sometimes deemed security risks, targets for potential enemy exploitation. Operation Protective Custody, according to documents Holbrook eventually obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests and leaked sources, was designed to relocate and protect children who were believed to be at risk of foreign intelligence recruitment. The program operated from 1958 to 1964, was run by a joint CIA Defense Department task force, and involved the forced adoption of at least 43 American children into military families overseas. Bucky Andrew had been taken not by a random predator, but by an operative who believed, in a twisted Cold War logic, that he was protecting the child from potential Soviet espionage efforts. Robert Andrew, with his impending Vietnam deployment and his access to classified information, had been flagged as a potential security vulnerability. The solution: remove his son, create a new identity, and eliminate the leverage point. It was, Holbrook realized with horror, kidnapping as national security policy. On March 20, 1999, Margaret Andrew and Michael Reyes met in person for the first time in 38 years. They chose neutral ground, a therapist's office, with psychological support standing by. Margaret looked at the man her son had become, 45 years old with dark hair, died, she'd later learn. Successful, with his own family. He looked nothing like the 7-year-old she remembered, yet when he smiled nervously, she saw it. The slightly crooked front tooth, unchanged after all these years. "Bucky?" she said tentatively. "Michael," he corrected gently, then added, I don't remember being Bucky." And that was the cruelest truth of all. Margaret had found her son alive, but the boy she'd been searching for was truly gone. 38 years of false identity, of constructed memories, of a life built on someone else's crimes. Those years couldn't be returned. Michael Reyes stopped sleeping in March 1999. Night after night, he stared at the ceiling, trying to reconcile two incompatible truths. He was Michael Reyes, Sacramento software engineer, husband, father, and he was also Bucky Andrew, stolen child, the subject of his biological mother's 38-year search. "I feel like I'm dissolving," he told Dr. Sarah Martinez, his trauma psychologist. "Like if I pull at any thread of who I think I am, the whole thing will unravel." James Holbrook's investigation had expanded dramatically. Operation Protective Custody wasn't a rogue operation. It had official sanction, buried deep within Cold War security protocols. Between 1958 and 1964, a joint CIA Defense Department task force had systematically relocated 43 children of military personnel through falsified adoptions. The criteria for high-risk children were disturbingly broad: parents with top-secret clearances, families near strategic installations, children who'd overheard classified information. Bucky Andrew was case number 17. Internal memos, now declassified, revealed the cold calculus: removal of the R. Minor eliminates leverage point for foreign intelligence. Acceptable losses for national security objectives. Acceptable losses. Margaret Andrew read those words in Holbrook's office, her hands shaking. "They made me think I was crazy for 38 years, she whispered. "And all that time, someone knew exactly what happened to my son." The story broke on September 15, 1999. Cold War program systematically kidnapped military children. Congressional hearings were announced immediately. The CIA issued carefully worded statements acknowledging the program while emphasizing it reflected the security concerns of a different era. Michael testified before Congress on November 3, 1999. He sat at the witness table and spoke with devastating clarity. "My name is Michael Reyes. I was born Bucky Andrew. I was 7 years old when my government decided I was a security risk and kidnapped me. For 38 years I lived a lie, not because I chose to, but because powerful people decided national security was more important than a child's right to his own identity." His testimony went viral. Within days, Michael became the face of the program's victims. But visibility came with costs. His marriage strained under pressure. His 16-year-old daughter struggled with the revelation that her grandfather had participated in a kidnapping program. His son withdrew, confused by his father's transformation. And then there was Margaret, his biological mother, a stranger who looked at him with desperate love, seeing a 7-year-old boy in the face of a 45-year-old man. They met weekly for therapy. The sessions were painful, full of landmines. Margaret would reference memories Michael didn't share. She'd call him Bucky, then catch herself and apologize. I know I should be. Grateful he's alive, Margaret told Dr. Martinez. But I can't help grieving for the 38 years I lost. Michael added quietly. And I grieve for Bucky Andrew, the child I was supposed to be. I'll never know that person. Neither will you. Legal battles began in early 2000. Multiple families filed lawsuits. The government claimed sovereign immunity and national security concerns, but public pressure was immense. In May 2000, Congress passed the Cold War Children's Act, providing financial compensation to verified victims and establishing a truth commission. Michael received $2.3 million. Margaret received $1.8 million. The money felt obscene, as if decades of suffering could be quantified. Holbrook identified 37 of the 43 known victims. 6 remained unaccounted for, deceased, untraceable, or unwilling to come forward. He connected families, facilitated reunions, helped piece together identities deliberately shattered by their own government. But for Michael and Margaret, the question remained. How do you rebuild a relationship that should have existed for 38 years but didn't? How do you mourn a childhood while celebrating survival? The answer they discovered was slowly and with profound grace. Some wounds never fully heal. They simply become part of who we are. The question isn't whether Michael and Margaret could reclaim what was stolen, but whether they could build something new from the ruins of what should have been. On August 13, 2000, exactly 40 years after Bucky Andrew disappeared from Fort Hamilton, Margaret Andrew sat at her dining room table with a man who was both her son and a stranger. Michael had flown from Sacramento to Brooklyn for this anniversary, understanding its significance even if he couldn't fully share its weight. For 40 years, Margaret had lit a candle and set an empty place at this table. This year, for the first time, that place was filled. I don't remember that day, Michael said quietly, looking at the old photographs Margaret had spread across the table. I've tried. Dr. Martinez says, the trauma probably erased it, or maybe they gave me something to suppress the memories, but it's just blank. Margaret reached across the table, her aged hand covering his. Then we'll build new memories. We can't get back what was taken, but we can create something forward. It was a philosophy, born from brutal acceptance. The previous 18 months had been a masterclass in managing expectations and navigating grief that had no clear resolution. Michael wasn't the 7-year-old boy Margaret had lost. He was a fully formed adult, with his own family, his own trauma, his own identity. Crisis to navigate. But he was also her son. DNA confirmed it. And slowly, painfully, they were learning what that could mean in practical terms. The process involved weekly phone calls that sometimes lasted hours, sometimes only minutes before becoming too emotionally overwhelming. Michael would share stories from his life, his wedding, his children's births, his career achievements. And Margaret would listen with joy and grief intertwined, celebrating moments she'd missed while mourning their absence. Margaret, in turn, shared what she'd learned during her 38-year search. She gave Michael the boxes of letters, the newspaper clippings, the maps marked with potential leads. This is what your disappearance did, she explained. This is how much you were loved, even when we thought we'd never find you. Michael spent weeks reading through his mother's obsessive documentation. Each letter represented hope. Each dead-end lead represented heartbreak. The accumulated weight of her persistence was almost unbearable to witness. I don't know if I could have done what you did, he told her during one visit. 38 years of searching, never giving up. You do what you must, Margaret replied simply. You were my child. There was no alternative. Robert Andrews' absence haunted these conversations. He'd died in 1994, 5 years before Bucky was found, carrying the guilt of a son he believed lost forever. Margaret kept his photo on the mantel, the young sergeant in his uniform smiling confidently before Vietnam destroyed that confidence. He never stopped blaming himself, Margaret told Michael. The investigation made him a suspect initially, and even though he was cleared, something broke in him. He went to war thinking he'd failed to protect you. He came, back knowing he'd never see you again. Michael stood before his father's photo, this man he'd never known but who'd shaped his existence through absence. I wish I could tell him it wasn't his fault. He knows now, Margaret said softly. I have to believe he knows. The broader implications of Operation Protective Custody continued to unfold. James Holbrook's investigation, now supported by congressional mandate, had evolved into a comprehensive truth commission. Public hearings brought forward other victims, other families, other stories of institutional kidnapping disguised as national security. Patricia Chen, taken at age 6 from a naval base in San Diego, reunited with her sister after 42 years. The sisters wept, held each other, then spent hours simply looking at each other's faces, finding family resemblances in the shapes of their eyes, the curves of their smiles. David Morrison, taken at age 8 from an Air Force base in Nevada, discovered his mother had died still searching for him. His reunion was with younger siblings he'd never known existed, who'd grown up in the shadow of their missing brother. Each story followed similar patterns: systematic, targeting, methodical execution, decades of institutional silence. The Truth Commission documented it all, creating an official record that transformed individual tragedies into acknowledged historical crime. In December 2000, the government issued formal apologies. The ceremony was held in Washington with victims and family members present. The Secretary of Defense read a prepared statement acknowledging that Operation Protective Custody represented a grave violation of civil liberties conducted under the misguided belief that national security justified the separation of families. Michael sat in the audience holding Margaret's hand. The apology felt hollow. Words cannot undo decades. But it was something. Official acknowledgement, historical record, a promise that such programs would face scrutiny in the future. But the most profound changes happened quietly, in private moments, of connection and reconstruction. Michael's children, Elena and David, gradually came to know their grandmother Margaret. Initially awkward, the relationship deepened as the teenagers recognized in her something of their father's determination and resilience. Elena began interviewing Margaret about her search, creating an oral history project for school that became something much more personal. Patricia Reyes, Michael's wife, found her own path to acceptance. She'd married Michael Reyes. She was now building a relationship with the Michael who was Bucky, learning that identity isn't fixed but fluid, and that love means embracing someone's complexity rather than demanding simplicity. Michael himself began the slow work of integration. Dr. Martinez helped him understand that he didn't have to choose between Michael and Bucky. He could be both and neither, and something entirely new formed. From the collision of stolen identity and recovered truth, he started writing. First in private journals, processing memories and emotions too complex for conversation, then publicly, contributing to the Truth Commission's documentation project, helping other victims articulate their experiences. His memoir, Acceptable Losses: A Stolen Childhood and the Long Road Home, was published in 2002. It became a bestseller, not because people wanted sensationalism, but because Michael's measured, honest exploration of identity, loss, and reconstruction resonated with anyone who'd ever questioned who they were and where they belonged. Margaret attended the book launch sitting in the front row watching her son, speak about his experience with eloquence and vulnerability. She cried, not from sadness, but from pride in the man he'd become, despite everything designed to break him. On August 13, 2005, 45 years after the disappearance, 3 generations of the Andrew family gathered in Brooklyn. Margaret, now 77, Michael, 52, Elena and David, now young adults, Patricia, and James Holbrook, who'd become something like extended family through his role in their reconnection. They planted a tree in Fort Hamilton with permission from the base commander. A plaque read, "In memory of all children taken by Operation Protective Custody and in honor of the families who never stopped searching." Michael placed his hand on the bark, looked at his mother, and said, "We're here. We made it." Margaret smiled, and in that smile was everything. The 45 years of pain, the relief of resolution, the acceptance that some losses can never be fully recovered, and the determination to love forward regardless. The story of Bucky Andrew didn't end with happy reunion. It ended with something more honest. The acknowledgement that trauma leaves permanent marks, that justice is imperfect, that time stolen cannot be returned, but that human connection, stubbornly pursued, can create meaning even from profound loss. Operation Protective Custody was officially condemned. Victims received compensation. The historical record was corrected. But the most important victory was quieter. Families learning to be families again, even when the shape of that family was nothing like what should have been. Margaret Andrew died peacefully in 2008, at age 80. She was buried next to Robert. At her funeral, Michael stood before the assembled mourners and spoke. "My mother taught me that love is the most stubborn force in the universe. It doesn't give up. It doesn't forget. And it finds a way, even when the path seems impossible. I was lost for 38 years, but I was never unloved. That made all the difference. The shadow of war had taken Bucky Andrew, but the persistence of love had brought him home. Not unchanged, not undamaged, but home nonetheless. And in the end, that stubborn persistence, that refusal to accept loss as final, was the only victory that truly mattered.